after the fourth minute. Try not to vocalize it till then, but I'll ask for one POI around the fourth minute. With that being said, starting my speech in three, two, one, go. I think like the purpose that religion is in general supposed to serve in your life is like very, very different from like what an educational institution, especially like an educational institution of higher eminence, like colleges and universities mean to most students around the world, right? More so of like students who actually go to these reputed institutions which were started by like religious authorities and organizations in the past, right? We feel like these two things are like entirely different, and it is at best if these two things don't meddle, because the overall like message which comes out when these two things like meddle in the form of like the practices that an educational institution purports on you are like just very meddled and like very not so good, and like they don't serve either purpose either like on net, but they actually have like a negative impact. What do these religious institutions then look like, right? I feel like these religious institutions were in general started by these like religious these educational institutions were started by these religious authorities and organizations in like deep past to do two things. A, they were started as like a philanthropic thing to actually like give back to society and like start good education institutions where students could get like really good education. But also they were started with a like higher ulterior motive of these religious institutions to actually go ahead and like propagate their own religion. Like this looks like a lot of like Christian institutions which were set up in like India during like the colonial rule and like things of these sorted by the British, right? To in general like purport like British ideas and just like in general Christian ideas and a lot of these things, right? But also like institutions started by like missionaries and a lot of these things in India by like the Christian missionaries, right? Their purposes were two then: A, to propagate more religion in like young minds and young students, but also B, to serve like a philanthropic purpose, right? What do we on OG mean by when we say like we want to actively distance ourselves from the religious affiliations of these institutions then, right? A, this looks like we no longer impose certain like practices and beliefs that these inherent religions necessarily impose on you, right? This looks like certain prayer practices which the college like starts with itself, or like starts most programs with, which are like inherently Christian if it's like a Christian institution, or like inherently Islamic if it's a Muslim institution, or whatever that thing is, right? We want them to like no longer do what a particular religion follows when it looks like all of these beliefs which are imposed on all of the students of these institutions. But secondly, we also want like key administrative changes and like key structural changes in the administration in general of these institutions, right? This no longer looks like your certain administrative positions, or like most of your administrative positions are only open to people from the church, right? This does not look like there's only fathers and like nuns and sisters coming at and serving at like key administrative positions in these institutions, but more so these are open to almost everyone, and you actually take in people who are actually much more highly qualified for these jobs to go ahead and do these things, right? What is the impact of this? I think A, at the point at which you open administration for like more people out there, you're just getting a bigger talent pool that applies, and a big like a much more vast number of people that you can select from, which means that in general the quality of administration is going to be better. But also you get people who've inherently served in a lot of colleges before, who have more experience of serving in like administration, which means that the kind of ideas these people bring regarding administration are just fresher and like much more effective and like much more newer, right? Second, one important point of preemptive rebutting before I go on to my main pushes, right? I think like opposition cannot come and put the burden on us that, oh, funding will significantly reduce because these religious organizations right now would no longer want to fund you at the point at which you actively distance yourself from it, right? We feel like this won't happen on two reasons, but even if it happens, we have alternatives. I think A, the religious institution that started your the religious organization that started your institution, that started your university, still wants to be associated with it because the history is never going to change, right? I think St. Xavier's College will always be known to be started by like Jesuit organizations and like Jesuit people, which means that that thing is never going to change, which means that these people still want credit for being the original people, the original religious organization which started them, which means that even if you now want to make your organization more secular, more open to people from other religions and all, these people would still not want to reduce significantly cut down funding. They might reduce it to a certain extent because they're angered temporarily, but they might not reduce it. But even if they do, we feel like the state in general is going to have a bigger incentive to go ahead and do funding. Why? The state inherently prioritizes education to a large extent, right? Which means that the state already has like enough funds allocated to like start bigger institutions of higher eminence and all of these things, right? At the point at which this is an already existing institution which is so reputed enough and so old enough, it is going to be easier for the state to jump on a running bandwagon and go ahead and fund these institutions which are already established and already have certain, reputation, and are known for being like good institutions of education and all within people, rather than going ahead and starting new institutions. Which means even if like religious funding completely cuts off, which it never will, but even if we can see that it does, we feel like the state funding will come in and sufficiently fill in that gap, because the state has all of these incentives, right? Going on to then, and to why, integrating religious philosophy is going to be inherently bad, and why secularism as a push will be much better for these religious institutions. Understand that the demographics have like vastly changed, right? The people that join these institutions are no longer like just Christians if it's a Christian institution, or just Islamic if it's an Islamic institution. Why is this? These institutions are so old and have been funded and have been functioning for so long, which inherently means that these institutions have gained a lot of, prominence amongst people, and are known to be like, pretty good institutions and all. Which means that, at the point of time, you have like a lot of other people, other students from like other religions coming and like joining your institutions and like studying there. At that point in time, when you actually go ahead and like impose these certain religious beliefs of that one particular religion onto students of other religions, not that these are like college students, these are like people who are like just, exiting teens and like adulting, young adulthood. Which means that most of these people don't really associate themselves with like, even their religion. Even if it's like Christians joining this institution or people of other religion, they don't inherently associate themselves with their religion or identify with like the key, things that a religion is supposed to serve in your life as much during this particular point of their life, right? Which means that for these people, these religious practices, these religious beliefs are going to be, absurd at the very least, and something like a serious imposition which is done on them, something which inherently, limits their freedoms, or like limits their, inherent expressions to a certain extent. What is this then going to do? At the point at which you have like a very rigid, religious dogma that you follow within your college, within your institution, where people from other religions join, or people from even your religion, right? At that point, it is going to look to these students that you are imposing these certain beliefs on them. You are, going ahead and like limiting their freedoms for a certain extent. You are going ahead and like, making them follow these certain things. You're just inherently like limiting their freedoms. This inherently going to like limit the quality of experience that they have when they come to these colleges, and like the kind of interactions that they have with other people and all. But this also inherently going to distance themselves from religion even more. This is a point of time where these people's minds are inherently very, deeply like engravable and like shapeable, right? At this point, if they feel like, oh, religion is something which is heavily limiting and like, not very liberal, given that these are inherently college students, which means most of them are like, very very liberal in just in general, like because of the point of time they are in life. Which means that these people are going to feel like, oh, this institution is inherently not very liberal, which means that religion by association is not very liberal and not something that I want to engage myself in with more. Which means that the inherent purpose that religion is supposed to serve is going to be like, compromised. More so in my DPM on why education gets compromised and like hampered. But for all those reasons, proud to propose.
I thank Prime Minister for their brilliant remarks, and I call upon Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Hello. Can I check if I can be heard?
Loud and clear.
Okay, awesome. Religious universities are diverse. They offer you choices across the spectrum. These are choices on top of secular public universities already. So this can be a difference for a secular person having to choose between a well-funded religious university or a badly funded secular public university, or for a student from a religious community to be allowed to go to school at all. I'm going to talk about the spectrum first. So religious universities integrate religion into education to different degrees. On one end, you have like Baylor's University. And the difference here is just that you have to take one or two theological or religious classes a semester. In the middle of the spectrum, you have like Yonsei University, where on top of educational classes on religion, you have like light chapel service requirements. And then all the way, you have IIUM in Malaysia, where the university is a Muslim university. They have strict rules regarding, for example, like no males in female dorms or no drinking, etc. This information is all very public. Alumni will tell you this. There's information online. There is information from the school website. In some cases, the application to the school itself requires you to fill out a statement of faith. So it's impossible to be misled by such an institution. So the harms from OG is unclear, because whether is it the case that you lose these freedoms, it's actually dependent on who you are. When you self-select to go to these institutions, then this is not really a harm to you. In fact, it's a benefit because you can live in an environment where you feel as though your faith is better respected. But even if it's the case that you're a secular person, if you chose to go to these universities and they take you, then you're making an active choice because presumably could have gone elsewhere. I also want to clarify that the religious affiliation do not interfere with the quality of education, because in the end, these are still world-class institutions. They still produce engineers and scientists. So obviously you have to learn relevant things that you can get a job with. And therefore, I don't think this is just a matter in this debate. The prime question I want to ask here is what will happen when these universities distance themselves from religious affiliations? Our case is that the amount of funding that you get is going to be drastically lower. And the reason is simple. A lot of this funding comes from people practicing the faith or religious institutions themselves. These are private donations, which means that if it wasn't for this mechanism of religious affiliation, funding would be lost. So this is funding on top of government funding. So OG is right in saying that government has money, but they have magic money, right? Like it cannot be the case that they just magic out more money to make up for the net loss. On our side, we're saying governments can still fund the secular public universities. We have another option that is funded from a private source that otherwise would not exist if you cease this political affiliation. They try to say maybe it's the case that religious institutions will still want to fund because they want to take credit for setting up the institution. But you already have gotten the credit for it. Like, how can it be lost? The agenda, however, is actually to support the faith in name, right? You want to be constantly trying to put money into, help uplifting people of your faith. Then it's also easier to justify, for example, within a religious institution. Like, let's say some people do not want to fund education because they want to, for example, do soup kitchens or just give it to like more church services. But if it's the case that you're someone there within those organizations, you believe in education, you can make your case and say, hey, actually, we're still supporting the faith because these people are people who are one of us. They believe in our way of life and they are our brothers and sisters, and therefore money should go to them. So there is sizable money. This is money that government does not have, that we have as a delta, and that money will indeed be lost if you cease political affiliation. What is this money used for? I think it's used for a lot of things. It is used for improving and maintaining education infrastructure. So for example, new computer labs for computer science or Bloomberg terminals for people learning finance. And obviously, as the needs of education changes, then this allows universities to respond quite robustly with new infrastructure. It is also used to improve teaching quality. So for example, like online learning for access, or like hiring just more qualified professors. It's used to improve access itself, and this is important. For example, money to build infrastructures like dormitories so that people from far away can come to the city to study and live there, or school bus services so they can just be shuttled back and forth. Otherwise, because of the fact that the school campus is just too big, like you cannot get around. Or in general, just provide scholarships, for example. This argument is actually quite important because in many places, there can be universities, but the universities might not be giving access to the average person. Most secular schools do not have the money to improve accessibility. So they channel all of that money towards, for example, like just trying to keep the school running or doing the bare minimum to keep the curriculum going. But because we have more resources, because the amount of funding here is larger from like the entire faith, and also because there's an intrinsic emotional actualization in supporting your faith, we have more money, but there's also an incentive to increase its accessibility. And what that means is the agenda for these schools isn't to just make money, it's to increase access to the faith itself or increase access to education for the people who hold the faith, which means that like on the net delta, it's not just that we have more schools, it's that the kind of schools that we have also uniquely improve access for people. Why is this a good thing? Public education can actually fail. It's actually unclear why the state can build enough universities. Even if it's the case that they can, it's unclear if universities are good. Even if it's the case that they're good, it's unclear why they're accessible. Private for-profit universities exist, but they are more expensive. What that means is clear. We have more choice. Even for a secular person, they can make the trade-off to go here to get a better education if they have to just like expose themselves to the faith. That's a choice that we allow them to make. Arguably, this is a choice that is good for that person, especially if it's the case that they make it. But on their side of the house, this choice does not exist. Before I go on, I'll take that POI.
Closing or opening?
Closing.
Yeah. So do you think the Malaysian government is going to fund secular universities on your side of the house?
This debate cannot happen in Malaysia. It just cannot. I think you have to choose a more charitable premise here. If it's the case that you're really forcing the matter, I think certain schools still exist. But given that the entire population is that religious already, like I don't think it makes a clear difference. But if you really want to take the debate there, I'm going to talk about my second extension, and that is, for the most conservative of societies, this is actually the only way for young people to go to universities. And the reason for that is because conservative people don't actually exactly have a good impression of colleges. It's a young collection of young people. They drink, they smoke, they hook up. Like, it feels as though people can be led morally astray. And the impression of college life is generally controlled and given out by Western media through your, for example, coming of age movies. Because otherwise, what does it look like to be in university? So most people would, for example, know what Cambridge and Harvard would look like before they know about what their own university life might look like. On outside the house, it's just much easier to justify to your parents or other community leaders that you should be allowed to go to universities to improve your quality of life because of the fact that it's not going to intervene with your religious and moral actualization. This is especially important because we argue that these are the most vulnerable group of people. So there's a spectrum of who is oppressed. Maybe we oppress the students in school in some arbitrary way, but we return to them much further empowerment because they can get a job, they can go out and make their money, they can, like, for example, just distance for themselves from those communities later on. It's on your side of the house where you doom the most religious communities to ban their children from attending college altogether because they feel as though in sanctioning that decision, they doom their children to hell.
I thank Elo for that fine speech, and I call upon Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for OG. Here. DPM, OG, are you present?
Yeah, I'll take 30 seconds. I'm very sorry.
Okay, no worries.
So that can happen.
Okay. Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The opposition falls out of this debate the moment they say that people can simply choose to not go to a very religious college and go to a secular college. The entire impacts are contingent on them proving that people have actually a free choice to choose between these religious college and other college, and both the qualities of these college are going to be equal. So them making a decision to go to a secular college will be as give equal results at religious college. I understand that first of all, people do not have a choice because in many regions and many areas there is not enough resources to like fund many colleges. That means there's only 1 or 2 colleges available for people, and in these type of cases scenario, or in majority of cases scenarios, the one which was funded historically by a lot of religions is much better. Why panel? Because these institutions are very old and they have been getting this funding since a very long time. That means the quality of resources that they provide to these students in terms of infrastructure, in front of resources for research projects and things like that, is probably very high because they have been funded historically from these religious institutions from the moment when even the state was not established, or from the moment even when the country was not even like freed, or the government institutions were not even made. That means these institutions are already very big, very well established, and the quality is very subpar as compared to any other non like secular college that is out there. So when you come up and say that you provide a free choice for students to choose between this college or that college, it is not actually a free choice. Students are coerced into choosing this one particular religious college at the cost of other freedoms of them going away, because they have to do it. They, on an individual level, it looks like, ah shit, I'll take this 2 or 3 more courses, or I'll keep wearing this uniform in the college, at the cost of which I'm getting like subsidized education or better research services for my research projects and things like that. That means the free choice that they have been projecting on their side is actually not free. People are forced to choose it because there are better options are not available and things like that. Now coming to the point of access and things of those sort, I think access is mostly fiated on their end because they never give how is access being provided to more open how are these religious colleges more inclusive to minority communities on their side? When a particular religion has been funded by these religious institutions, they are more likely to, impose the conservative religious policies onto the students, onto the selection process, and onto the reserve seats or scholarships or things like that they give to the students in the first place. That means these quality of the access of resources, even if you're bringing in students from other minority communities, the access to other resources is not very inclusive, and you don't make people feel better because you get this extra fund from these religious people whom you have to keep making happy on your side of the debate. That means when you make this religious institutions more secular by all the reasons, by all the features that Diya has already given to you, you make it more inclusive for these for the other students, because now you don't have to impose the idea of purity of religious caste onto these people as you were doing earlier, because you had to maintain those conservative ideas which you were otherwise following. But also secondly, racism in the process of administration is gone, because you remove those people out of the administration itself, religious leaders and things of those sort. That means some amount of racism that these students could have faced is gone. That means you're making the environment slightly more inclusive for other minorities, and the environment is more welcoming to you. At that point of time, you feel that this religion is not imposed on me. The Even if you want to practice your religion, the church will still remain in the college, but you're not forced to attend the masses, or you're not forced to wear a certain kind of uniform, or you're not forced to greet the fathers and go to or follow those rituals every single particular time. That means you have improved access and improved environments. But also when they come up and talk about the only benefit that they say on their side, like, oh, job availability is better on their side because they get more fundings and things of those sort. But I understand that we have given you enough reasons of why funding will still retain on our side. I'll build up on it like much later. But also, job is something which is symmetric on both ends. I don't understand that why a particular college why even if this previously religious college becomes secular now, why job availability is going to go away? Companies come to a particular college because they see the quality of students and the quality of resource projects and research that the students have done, and they think that this student particular is going to be very beneficial for the company, so they hire them on those basis. They don't hire on the basis of what religion does the student follow, because companies work on profitability. They just want good quality of students that they want. That means jobs are majorly symmetric on both ends. I don't understand how do you bring in like more jobs on your side of the paradigm. But also we maintain those image neutrality of this college itself within the state. That means state is more incentivized to fund this college particularly because state has incentives to make its image look more secular in front of other people to gain more votes of other students. That means if the state for a state to start another education institution from scratch versus funding and previously religious college which is now trying to become secular is much better, because now the state can put its image as to it is promoting education, but also state is promoting secular education, and more and more people get attracted to it. The state has specific incentives to do it in the first place. But also it is good for the student on their level. We already explained why teenage students specifically have no interest in religions, because these people want freedom when they come to college. I want to drink, I want to have sex when, and if my particular college establishing or imposing these rules and creating those dorms and things of those sorts, I feel more secluded, and the environment becomes worse for me because these things are being imposed onto me. I'm not doing it by choice. But also, even if I don't want to do these things or things of those sort, even if I'm not very religious, the thing is that I'm not doing it out of my own self. I'm not doing it out of my own ideas. These things are being propagated everywhere. You feel that your mind is getting churned into those ideas rather than them flowing freely into, because these teenagers want to selectively choose what they like about a religion and what they do not like. When they went through social media, they have ideas of like LGBTQ communities, having those kind of societies who are very woke societies in your colleges is good. These people feel included in those colleges. These people feel that the college environment is good. When students feel that college environment is good, they feel more welcomed in the college. They feel more enthusiasm to learn from those teachers of those sorts. Then how do the alternatives that we have are still better on our side of the paradigm? Because government grants still exist. I already gave you the reason of how government's incentives are far more increased on our side. But also alumni networks still exist. Panel understand that alumni networks are still leveraged to give fundings to these colleges. But also crowdfunding exists. If this college wants to take funding for some specific initiative that has begun and some specific project, it can always begin with crowdfunding. So societies within college can go for crowdfundings. This happens specifically in my college, where my research society takes funding from other institutions, from LinkedIn or bigger companies which are already in those fields, and those companies are like ready to give it to me because the quality of education, and they trust in the quality of students' education which is being provided. And people will be more likely to give funding because they believe in the discipline and the culture of this college, because it has been very old and it has historically produced, better quality of students from a very long time. But also religious institutions are still incentivized to do it because they want to protect their image. They want to protect the credits that they have been getting from a very long time. This is more tokenistic donations that they are giving. Even if these donations decrease, we make it more inclusive. We make it better quality by improving the administration on our side of the paradigm. Very proud to propose.
I thank DPM for their brilliant remarks, and I call upon Diya to continue.
I'm back. Sorry for giving
Okay, go on.
a few minutes.
Okay, I will start. Okay, Ken, I will start my speech. Opening government rests their case on a pretty funny line, right? They say that religious minorities who don't identify with the beliefs of the majority in these colleges, they feel oppressed and they can't have sex or whatever. I'm gonna make a bolder claim, which is that they're denied admission altogether and they do worse in these colleges. This is bad because when poor religious minorities in these nations can't realistically access higher education, that's the pathway to which they are denied higher salaries in the future, uplifting the communities. They are more likely to do things to radical violence because they tend to be poorer because they can't access education. That sort of shtick, that's the thrust of CG. So the first thing to prove is the premise. Why are they denied access to these universities on their side of the house? Firstly, often they're denied admission altogether. Administrative officers will deny a lot of these people for not being of the right religion, as OO helpfully points out. They'll say things like, oh, you're just not a right fit for this college, and then they're denied admission. But secondly, often they can't do well in classes to begin with. Like in the Islamic University of Malaysia in Malaysia, Sharia law classes are mandatory for all students. And if you're not familiar with that kind of religion, obviously you'll do worse on those kinds of tests. Often these are also classes which are taught in a specific language, like Muslim, but if that's your third language, again, you're not going to be able to do well. The op response obviously was secular schools still exist. You can go to the well-funded public schools. The problem then is that where this debate is most relevant are in religious societies. And the problem is that when historically religious universities exist, they tend to outweigh the number of secular universities. So there's a lot of religious universities. There are not that many secular universities. The reason is twofold. Firstly, as a matter of historical fact, the church was rich and powerful and had a lot of energy and time to do things like advanced mathematics, science, and the humanities. That's why they did things like set up colleges like Christ Church College in Cambridge. Maybe they're converted to become more secular now. The point is that these are the examples whereby there's the religious historical association that continues into the present. But secondly, to the extent that governments choose to fund universities at all, they tended to fund religious universities because precisely they wanted to appeal to religiosity and being moral individuals, as it were, within their parliament. That's why they didn't fund the secular ones, they didn't build secular ones, they would obviously fund the historically powerful religious one and just give them money there. The obvious problem then, if you believe all of this argumentation, is that minorities are systematically locked out of accessing higher education. Maybe secular universities exist sometimes, but one, they don't get sufficient amounts of funding from the government, and two, they are far and few between. Maybe they're really far away from where you live in. It's on another island in the Philippines, and that is a bad thing for a lot of religious minorities that don't feel the same way as the majority. What was the comparative OG failed to defend? No thanks, chat please. Firstly, I would contest that when you retain the name of the university, we're not making it the Secular University of Malaysia, it's still the Islamic University of Malaysia. The difference is that you don't make university-wide Islamic policy mandatory for everyone. And I think these schools on our side should do this in smart and intelligent ways. For instance, you can big up the fact that there's an optional Islamic studies course. You can even say that we're going to allocate more funding towards that, and that distracts away from the fact that we're decreasing the fact that everyone has to take a Sharia law class. Notice also, the government can still appeal to religiosity because we're reducing the extent of religious influence. It's still going to have a religious name on the front that still works for our side of the house. Notice at the end of this that obviously our religious minorities are more important than the poor people of the religious majority on that side of the house. So to the extent that most schools in this country are religious and the governments will keep funding them on either side of the house, the only realistic thing to do is to make them less religious and to lower the barrier to entry for access for everyone within the nation. This is good morally, principally, and pragmatically speaking, it leads to the increase of GDP, less unemployment if everyone in the country has a fair shot of accessing higher education. The next thing I want to prove then is why funding is relatively symmetric. OG merely says that religious organizations still want to be associated with the name. OO already responds to this. It's not sufficient. I will add 3 or 4 mechanisms here. Firstly, often, and just pragmatically, factually speaking, religious organizations are moral and good. They want to still help, and they'll still do things like give bursaries in the same way that the Red Cross doesn't discriminate. They give money to both Christians and non-Christians. I think they are good people. They'll still do it, honestly. Secondly, even if that's not the case, they still have incentives to do so in a large number of instances because the image of still giving charity to a university is good because churches fear that secularism is on the rise, so they want to maintain their image of goodwill. And the point here is that it's actually a bad look for them to withdraw that kind of funding on that side of the house, right? Like, it looks like really petty and vindictive. I think they would still do so to a relatively large extent. Thirdly, I think that the alumni networks that Thanh talks about, they still have a good memory of the times in the college and they still give money. And fourthly, let's say opposition is true, right? Like they stop donating to the universities and they donate to the food bank instead. They're still helping poor people. This money is better utilized on outside the house because it's not going into education that is honestly unnecessary for the religious minority in these sorts of contexts before making the trade-off.
So if the money in the soup kitchens is more important than giving these people education, why is it so important that they get admission to go to these schools anyway?
No, but like, how to say, like, these schools will not be totally bereft of funding because my point earlier was that the governments will still fund them to a large extent. And here's the trade-off. These schools maybe are less well-funded, these religious schools that make up the majority of the context where this debate is most relevant. The first thing I would note in this trade-off is that the quality of education presumably still remains high, even if the infrastructure is not as good. A lot of the donations, if it's used for things like building a shiny new auditorium or all that random shit, doesn't matter because what matters in university honestly isn't really the quality of education, as OG notes. It's about having the paper that says I'm a university graduate. We get more people that piece of paper, which allows them to go above the ceiling of what their salary cap is. That's how it works in the workplace, right? But secondly, to the extent that it's a worse education, this is a better world on CG because religious minorities can get through the door more easily. They are clearly more vulnerable because they need as much help as possible to even get into university to begin with. The majority of religions that they talk about, the religious majority, already have access to better high schools and middle schools. They already have access to things like madrasas if like the religions are so powerful in this sort of context. What was crucially important was that to the extent that the government was always going to fund certain types of schools, if it was always the case that they were religious, let's make them less religious so that people can access them on net.
I thank member of government for that fine speech, and I call upon the member of opposition to open up the case for CEO. Hear, hear.
Hello. Let me organize my notes, drink some water, your preference in like verbally, chat, anything works. Probably verbally. Okay, let me drink water and I'll get started. I have a massive sore throat. Audible? Good to go? Wonderful.
Yes to both.
I am not very sure how Justin's case works when on their side, lower levels of education like primary and secondary education still have religious institutions also. So if the problem is as giant as the Gov bench and especially CG wants to make it, then I'm unsure as to why they suddenly care at the point in which you're going to enter university, if education is always going to be skewed, if minorities are always going to be rejected from the point at which they are young, if they don't want to enter these religious institutions in the first place. But I think that shows that if that is the way you're going to think, then you probably need an environment at the point in which you've already been fed this sort of doctrine that OG wants to talk about, for example. Here's the big problem with the opening half, and is that no one is really proving whether your choice to choose between a religious or a secular university is legitimate outside of all the debate about funding, which in any country can look like a different kind of thing. A country where government really cares about education will probably fund a lot of secular public universities that provide like affordable education, or a country like Malaysia, like Tan rightfully points out, is probably not going to fund that thing in the first place, which is why the debate can't really take place in there, because then there's no debate to be held when they care about Bumiputra religion that much. But more importantly, they don't necessarily prove that the problem genuinely exists on that level in the first place. For instance, OG can say that the purpose of religion and the purpose of education are two different things, but they never necessarily prove that those are things that are diametrically opposed in a way that harms the quality of education enough to justify taking that choice away from not only those institutions to be able to have the religious aspects inside of their education environment, but also the ability of people to choose to be in their environments in the first place. I think everyone in the opening hub is assuming that you don't get a choice in choosing whether to enter that environment or not, or that you really don't want to enter an environment just because it is religious in the first place. I think Tan in OO has two responses. The first idea is, oh, it's a university, so obviously, right, the education is going to be good, which like isn't like the fullest extent of this, right? Even though that is correctly pointed out. But more importantly, he says that your affiliation gets you funding. What this doesn't ultimately prove is that education on that slant is legitimate, and we're going to contribute this to you in CO, that institutional religious affiliation is not just like a need or like not just like some sort of like last resort, but a perfectly legitimate choice, because we are the only like team that's going to tie up how students interact with the education environment in those universities in the first place, and without that environment in the first place. So here is a missing characterization in this debate. I think students who enter university are the age of majority in most countries that we're talking about here. So even if that doesn't really matter because it's a law, they still have a good degree of freedom to think and act at a stage in which they have just gained more independence in their lives than ever before. Opening wants to talk about how students that age who are drunk or just want to get hooked up, like that's literally the extent of their argument. Maybe like religious institutions can save them, right? But to the extent that OO proves that education is great for that kind, I think we are better in extending on this because we're able to prove to you that this is a benefit to perhaps all kinds of students, even if you're saying that we may have to trade off some minorities at the end of the day. I think fundamentally this is two things. The first idea is on your autonomy and your right to choice. I think at that point of time in which you're choosing what university to enter into, you still have your personal goods, values, and beliefs. And even if you're entering into a university who's like, let's say, like religious affiliations you don't necessarily align with, I think those personal goals, values, and beliefs still exist. So this necessarily means two things, right? You can like want to hook up every other day or just actually be religious, and insofar as to like a 26 or 27-year-old or whatever age like Tan is, those views are still legitimate to you at that age in which you're choosing to enter university as a person. Because number one, the law probably thinks you have that capacity to make right decisions for yourself, and I think 20 years is a pretty good time to have that sort of rationality in the first place. But more importantly, like I demonstrated to you, these values and beliefs probably exist either way. I think what government bench wants to necessarily claim is in the point in which you're entering those universities when you don't really believe in the doctrine and you're forced to take these kinds of classes. I think what this means is two things. The first is that you still have an option to opt out in the first place. Like what opening opposition already said, you have the opportunity to just not enter, no thank you, into those universities in the first place if you just don't want to be in that kind of environment. But even if you want to assume that you don't have that choice and you have to enter the university, for example, it's because it's affordable, I think this means two things. The first is that you're likely to be able to make like you're able to like make the trade-off to yourself because you probably recognize that your ability to get an education is necessary, and therefore it's more important that, let's say, as a poor person, you're able to get the affordable kind of education. So I think necessarily to a person like that, a student like that, is a worthwhile trade-off. Even if it isn't a worthwhile trade-off and you feel like outside of your like community inside of that university, I think what OG isn't doing enough of, or what CG also isn't doing enough of, is to have consistency in the sense that they don't want to tell us about whether these universities only have people who follow this certain religion, and or like whether people in these universities have people of different religions, even if one big religion is a majority, because obviously it's religiously affiliated. I think to the extent that you're still able to get and mix with that kind of community, even if you don't follow that religion, because you're likely to encounter other people of that religion, or perhaps you're likely to seek them out if the environment is as suffocating as government bench wants to make it out. I think that's still beneficial to your identity in the first place, because number one, we think it's worth it to you, but more importantly, that's just identity. I think that's why we're able to prove to you that religion is not that bad, and how we're going to prove to this is because the most important part of this debate is necessarily the valuation of religion and why we should protect it because of how people interact with it. Which is why we say, to people whose faith is a big part of their worldview, secular institutions also denies them access to an environment where they can constantly be in that environment and therefore practice their faith, in the sense that it also helps with like their identity when they're in that education in the first place. But the second idea is that you're talking about community, right? To the extent that we can say that it's also important for minorities to be in a situation in which they can also interact with other minorities, I think it's also important for people who are really religious to be able to find like-minded and no thank you comforting people like-minded individuals, also because it's comforting to be in that kind of environment, because university is just fucking stressful in the first place. It's an environment where you're free from judgment, and I think this is especially important, for example, because the opening half says you have the funding to have the education, but because of the religious affiliation, I think this means two things. I'm gonna do what Tan doesn't, and that is to actually flesh out the security to these vulnerable groups. The first idea here is that even if you want to say that you are reinforced by your own community and that religion is that horrific, then I think that it actively deters people who are religious from getting their education in the first place on a gov bench. But what we're able to do uniquely is, for example, for the most vulnerable groups like women who are like Muslim, for example, entering into a Muslim university may necessarily mean that you still have to have some of those ideals imposed onto you, but your ability to pursue higher education in an environment in which you are allowed to at least go to those classes in the first place, and perhaps a subsidized rate when you may not have the money in the first place, in a society that probably tells you that your role is like fundamentally as a woman in that environment not to be the one studying and not to be the one making the big bucks, I think you're still able to get that kind of education. That's the most valuable thing in the world. But I also want to flip OG's ideas on history underpinning these institutions, because first of all, most secular people don't really go anyway because of this. But if they are that poor, I think OG also has to say that you like that trade-off is worth it. But more importantly, we think that religious people don't want to go at a point which is secular. This is the thing that Tan talks about. But I also think that Justin just can't suka claim wherever there are religious unis, there are also secular unis, but of a smaller proportion. Like I think like no one really can agree on what the proportion is, because every single country is different. But like the inconsistency in government is on like how anti-minority these like universities are. Tan says there's a spectrum, which is correct, because you really can't frame this debate in a specific country whether there's like 90% of religious unis and 10% of secular universities. In the end, our worst case is that okay, you lock out some minorities from specifically these religious institutions because there are not many alternatives. But I think this has to be traded off with people who really want these schools and have that right to choice to decide these schools in the first place. I think that's the biggest skill on our side that we're able to uniquely prove to you. If their best case is that accessibility is increased, like what Justice says, if the paper is the most important, then religion never really mattered to these people in the first place. CO.
I thank that speaker for their brilliant remarks, and I call upon Government Whip here.
Hi, can I check if I'm audible?
Crystal clear.
Thank you. I'll first rebut CO and then talk about how we win on the two clashes of funding and religious minorities. First on CO. CO firstly brings in a principle that if primary or secondary schools within these majority religious societies are already going to be religious, why do we care about universities themselves being religious? I have a few responses to this. The first thing to say is that university is not comparable to secondary or primary education because firstly, these individuals oftentimes have to move away from home to attend this university. Where they live in rural areas or villages, they need to enter into that environment and completely immerse themselves within school life, live within dormitories, interact with the individuals around them. If they feel ostracized, this impact is magnified as opposed to in a primary or secondary school where locations are more localized and you can just go home afterwards. The second thing to say is that these results matter more, which is if you buy Justin's analysis that these individuals are likely to perform worse in these schools even if they are accepted, this means that they are damaged to a larger extent because the class of your degree it determines what kinds of jobs you have. It determines whether you can enter the civil service or whether you're going to have to struggle finding a job. These are all things that are more important, and that is why having specifically universities distance themselves from religion is important for these minorities. The second thing to say is that they bring up a principle of how it is important for people to have a hyper-religious environment for them to self-actualize. The first thing to say is that if you belong to a majority religion, you already have spaces to actualize your religion. You already have a society that largely or broadly agrees or shares the same sets of beliefs as you. You already have a family, you already can attend mosque or church, and these are all things that are normalized and not frowned upon. The truly vulnerable individuals or actors within this debate are individuals that simply do not have that other space to self-actualize. So the question I posit to CEO is this: why does the majority's right to religious self-actualization outweigh the education of minorities, even especially these minorities who don't even have places to actualize their own religion, on top of being unable to access education for the reasons that Justin gives? This principle is not articulated properly and never justified, therefore CEO is out of this debate. On to my two clashes. Firstly, on funding. There are two questions to answer under this clash. The first, what is the motivation of private donors? And secondly, does distancing yourself from religion remove this motivation on the part of these donors? On point one, OO says that donors only care about uplifting people within their own religious in-group. I want to contest this premise. Private donors are alumni or religious institutions that have been affiliated with these schools for a long period of time. There are reasons why they donate. Firstly, general charity, right? right? Understand that churches don't exactly always want to donate purely to religious causes. Like churches donate to non-religious charitable organizations like the Red Cross all the time. Like these are things that are still justifiable because they are for the betterment of society, even if these students are not particularly going to be part of that religious in-group. But even if like this is something that matters to them, understand that in these private universities, in these religious universities, a majority of the students will still be religious on either side of the house. So if this is if this is a factor that matters to donors, it's unclear why distancing yourself from religion and allowing for more minorities to enter your university is going to be the tipping point if most of the student populace will still be somewhat religious or affiliated with that religion. The second thing to say is that they care about legacy and prominence, and this incentive never changes, right? So the first thing to note is that the name and the history of the institution stays the same. I think OG says this, but they don't actually explain why brand association is important, even with the administration of the university distancing themselves from religion. The reason why it is still like prevalent and still a relevant factor is because optics-wise, from an external perspective, people who attend and donate to the church, who then uses their money to donate into several charitable causes, would view it as a worthy cause. Because like, you can have reform that is not as explicit. Justin says that you maintain the name, you maintain the names of the buildings, etc., and your reform can be less visible. You can still offer theology or religious studies courses. You just don't have to push it onto every single student. You can have it as an opt-out system. There's nothing in the motion that says that you have to completely or utterly like not engage with religion at all. We believe that as long as you do so in a measured way in which you control the optics of it, you will be able to retain a lot of private funding. The second thing we say is that you still have typical legacy reasons as to why you want to donate. You want your name on buildings, or want your name on scholarships. And most importantly, even if religious institutions and religious donors don't want to donate anymore, there are non-religious private donors that do have this interest. They do want their name on the most prestigious buildings in the most prestigious university in the state, and perhaps space opens up for these donors instead. So these are all plausible reasons as to why funding will not decrease to that large of an extent. But on the weighing, right, if institutions still need outlets to donate to because they have a duty to discharge this charitable duty, if in government a lot of these religious universities distance themselves, they still have to resort to donating to religious institutions anyway, because in a world wherein all universities are at least somewhat distant from religion, the best choice for you to donate is the one that still retains the religious name and the religious history. So in the long term, the funding will not be as different. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening.
I'm still quite confused by who you're trying to help. Are they the minorities that suffer all the way through public education because society is just religious, but at the point where they finish high school, suddenly have the ability to maybe go to universities?
No, okay. The difference here is that oftentimes for primary and secondary schools, what you have is some form of standardized testing. And this means that because state controls the education of like state administered schools before tertiary education, they do not have the ability to outwardly discriminate against religious minorities by making the standardized testing like include things like theology or religious knowledge. But once you move to university, the administration of the school or the religious institutions have more autonomy over the administration of education, and therefore can implement these religious norms within education to a larger extent, as opposed to primary and secondary schools, which are state-owned and still have to maintain that kind of optics if they don't want like racial discrimination or religious discrimination to be attributable to them. That is the difference here. On Clash 2, and most importantly, note that we prove a higher burden and opening government. Opening government explains that minorities within these schools are going to be ostracized. What we prove is we prove a higher impact, that maintaining the religiosity of these schools like completely ignores and prevents minorities from entering them in the first place. Justin says a few things that are important to note, but I want to flesh it out again. Firstly, is the lack of transparency in the admissions process, which means that you allow the biases of these people who are admitting students to fester. You allow them to deny religious minorities entrance into the school. But secondly, they lack the contextual knowledge to compete. So they can't do the prior tests, and they don't have they can't do faith declarations because they're not part of that religion. So if you buy all of these mechanisms, you'll believe that students on their side of the house are structurally locked out, and since they have failed to discharge the burden of proof that they have plausibly good alternatives for these students, understand that in hyper-religious societies where these religious universities are the best funded schools, we ought to make them more secular to accommodate minorities that are already oppressed in society. Never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
I thank Government Whip for that very, very fine speech, and I call upon Opposition Whip here.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I just realized that my laptop may not be good for me standing up. All right. Am I visible?
Visible and audible, yes.
All right, perfect. Okay. POIs through chat. If I don't take a POI by 5:30, feel free to just unmute. If I take a POI by then, don't unmute, just fully do it through chat. I would prefer cross-engagement, i.e. from opening government. And and I just want to put this disclaimer because I'm going to say something that I don't actually believe in. None of the things I say in this video or in this debate are representative of my actual views. I just have to debate the motion and debate it. Sorry, I just really have to say that out and get that off the way. So yeah, I'll be in.
Let's go, Eric.
Thank you, Imran. Thank you. All right, fuck everything from this debate, right? Because this is such a messy debate that is filled with deadlocks. I'm going to clean up each and every single one of these deadlocks because I think that Hamilton finally brings in the deadlock breaking idea, i.e. why is it the case that individuals have a certain right towards practicing their religiosities? And Reiya tries to come in and say, oh, but they don't actually prove this. But yes, we do prove this to you. Hamilton gives you literally 5 minutes of material as to why is it the case that your right towards religion is directly linked towards your right to choice, i.e. just the fact that the right to choice is something that is prerequisite towards you being able to access any of the benefits of life, i.e. the fact that the only thing that makes me an individual today, that makes me distinctly different from, for example, Justin, even though we both have relatively long hair, is the fact that I am, for example, able to practice my religions, able to do certain actions and ascribe certain actions to myself that make me distinct from him. These are the things that allow for individuals to form their identities, and absent from these choices and absence from these principles that allow for them to be able to actually practice their identities, these individuals will feel some level of self-doubt, some level of suffering from the fact that they cannot be themselves in these instances. Reiya then asks, why is it the case that these necessarily have to exist within schools? For the very simple reason that she points out, it is because most of the time when you go to become a university student is spent within universities. It is the fact that I have to stay within a dorm. It is the fact that I have to do things every single day that link myself towards a university. That means that my identity is most oftentimes practiced within these closed walls of a university, and insofar as they tell us that we cannot express ourselves and that we cannot actually be ourselves and have our identity within these walls of the university that I spend 99% of my time in, that means that you cut off 99 of these individuals' autonomy and 99% of these individuals' personalities. I'm going to take this debate down in the two different spectrums in which this debate has gone on to. Firstly, about normal societies taking out the opening case. Secondly, about super conservative societies taking out CO. Firstly, on normal societies. In here, I think that it is very clear as to what this debate has brought, what the opening clash has brought down to. It is about whether or not the funding for either one of these sites is actually going to continue. Because insofar as you buy that these fundings continue, then opening government wins. Because opening government is able to prove to you that these fundings will continue, except for the fact that it will now be allocated towards these. Except for the fact that the funding is now more allocated towards the individuals within more secular individuals, much rather than being only attributed towards religious individuals. If you believe the fact that this funding will be cut off, then opening opposition wins. However, none of these sites actually justify why is it the case, none of these sites actually justify why is it the case that just because something is opened up to another individual, that means that it is actually justified. Understand that the deadlock breaker here is why is it the case that these choices are legitimate? And by the way, POIs in chat, why is it the case that these choices are legitimate, and why is it necessary for us to protect these safe spaces? Because within these societies, it is very clear within normal conservative societies that oftentimes these individuals within these schools, within these secular societies, have other forms of alternatives. Because these are normal societies, at most it is about 50-50 gamble as to whether or not the good school is the secular school or whether it is the religious school. The question then is, why is it the case whether or not we actually have to open up the these religious schools towards the secular societies, even at the very best case of the government bench, in which funding continues to proliferate. And what are the costs of these things? And it is very simple. It is the fact that these choices are legitimate because of the analysis given by Hamilton. That means that these individuals particularly need a certain safe space for them to feel their own identities. It is the fact that when you remove these schools, it is the fact that when you remove these walls from them that were initially safe spaces that they could go to, much rather than secular schools, that removes the actual choice from them to be able to self-actualize themselves, become their own identity, and achieve the principles of why is it the case that religions are legitimate on outside of the house. When it comes down to it, this is the deadlock breaker that isn't present from OO because of the very simple idea that he merely tells us that these individuals are locked out, but he never actually tells us A, why they are locked out, and B, why is it the case that the fact that they are locked out is illegitimate. Considering the fact that opening government tells you that these are discriminatory policies, that doesn't actually help them. No, that's not what POI in chat means. Considering the fact that opening government tells you that these things are that these policies are currently discriminatory against secular individuals, they needed to principally prove why is it the case that this discrimination is fine in some way, shape, or form. We proved that to you, and thus we proved to you that within normal societies, in order to preserve this principle, this is necessary in order to protect these safe spaces, A, but B, we mitigate the idea about them not having any other choice because we tell you that within normal societies that they have other forms of alternatives. Next, let's take down CO, and why is it the case that they lose within even super conservative countries, which is just very simply that I just don't buy 99% of the things that they say. Firstly, understand that Reiya just basically points out that, oh yeah, like high school is different because you aren't as indoctrinated, because you don't spend a lot of your time there. Yeah, but it's the fact that I have to spend fucking 10 years of my life going through high school, going through middle school, where I'm considered indoctrinated, that still lead to me being indoctrinated and growing up within these systems. Secondly, but more importantly, understand that the very simple way they gave us is, oh, minorities are minorities, and because of that, they should be prioritized more. Understand that this isn't actually any significant form of weighing, and they don't ever tell us why is it the case that these small subsets of individuals should weigh out against the majority of individuals. This is important because I want you to think about the context in which they're selling us on. They're selling us a context of a world in which 90% of the population is a part of the majority religion, is majority religious. When you take this alongside the analysis given by, alongside the analysis given by Thanh about the very simple idea that individuals are oftentimes locked out of going within these institutions because of the fact that their religious institutions tell them that at the point in which they go into these religious institutions that they are sinning against their religion and that they're going to hell. What's happening here is that when you make each and every single one of the institutions that exist within these majoritarianly religious individuals, countries, these universities secular, that it leads to them not being able to access universities because it is seen as a damnation to them. Understand that what this means is that on-site closing opposition, what's happening on their side, is that these individuals, 90% of them, get locked out of universities because of the fact that the 90% of individuals who are religious can no longer access these forms of education because their religion directly contradicts it. But more importantly, we also, again, prove the legitimacy as to why is it the case that this also impedes on the idea of your own self-identity and that there is a principal harm that cannot be sacrificed. For all of these reasons, proud to oppose.
I thank opposition whip for that fine speech, and I thank everybody for what was overall a really, really fun debate to watch and adjudicate. I believe that we'll just move to the judging room and figure out a call. There will be no OA, so you'll just get the